Earlier this year, I don't know, maybe back in January or February, somewhere along that time frame, and Shep and I were talking one day, early in the morning, I suppose, and something was said about some of these fraud televangelists that you see on TV, and there's a stack of them, and I mentioned one of them. His name is Peter Popoff, and he is as despicable and duplicitous and as deceitful as they come. And one of the things that, and Shep had not ever seen him, and I don't know why, but I've watched him repeatedly, and one of the things that he does is that he hawks this miracle spring water in what look like ketchup packets. And so I guess he's got somebody to bottle tap water into ketchup packets, and then he hawks this. And what he wants you to do is to write in, call in, send in, preferably with a monetary gift, and he will send you miracle spring water that you can dribble it on your checkbook. You can put it on your knees, and it's a point of contact, and miracles will happen. And every time a miracle does happen, and that is this, you get poor and he gets richer. And so that's the miracle that happens consistently. Anyway, I got to thinking after that conversation, and I just looked him up online. I'd not been to this website, and I saw on there, click here to join our mailing list and get your own miracle spring water. Click. Name. Shep Bevis. Address. Let me look that one up. Email sbevis@gatecitybaptist.org. Anyway, so that happens a little bit later. All of a sudden, Shep buzzes me in my office with a very simple question, and candidly with not a particularly warm tone. He said, "You signed me up for miracle water." Oh, it was like music to my ears. I just loved it. So then he hung up, and I had to go pay a visit, or was gone for a little bit, and I came back, and I opened my email, and in the time before I left and from the time I got back, I had heard from Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, and Benny Hinn, thanking me for signing up for their stuff. Oh, it's on now. And I know more fraud televangelists than Shep does. And I signed him up for every one of them. In addition, he also expressed interest in becoming an Avon consultant, an Amway representative. The Jehovah's Witnesses thought he wanted to host an in-home Bible study. And the Mormons thought he wanted a copy of the Book of Mormon and a personal visit. And so, anyway, I was proud of myself. And that night, I needed a new pair of shoes. And I was trying on tennis shoes, and my phone rings. I didn't recognize this number. I answered it. Turns out it was Sears Roofing. Wanting to schedule my free consultation. And I said, "I'm sorry, you got me mixed up." The next call was from a dog trainer in Arizona saying, "We got your email about flower pot biting you, and you're too far away for us to help you." Anyway, so I show up the next morning, and we laugh about what has gone on, but then we both decided that let's just call it a truce. We'll call it a truce, because what's going to happen is that we're going to continue to escalate this, and now I'm going to sell or attempt to sell an imaginary truck that on Craigslist at an unbelievable price and put your phone number in. Anyway, so we decided we're just going to call it a truce, because it's going to be a tit for tat, back and forth, with no real victory. It's just a constant back and forth, a tit for tat. We've been talking about the enemy, both of God and of us, Satan. And we've talked about how he first got his start as an angel, chief among angels, but then how he went from becoming that to being the enemy of God and of us. And it seems that Satan was operating in that initial act of rebellion against God, certain that somehow he was going to achieve the goal of becoming like the Most High, and that God was somehow going to relinquish the control of the universe to him. And, of course, that didn't happen. It didn't turn out that way. He got some followers, but it was only a third of the angelic host. And as Satan is cast out of heaven, it seems that he's operating under this premise: we're just going to start a tit for tat. Completely unaware that his act of rebellion sealed his fate. Completely oblivious to the fact that he was, to use the cliche, cruising for a bruisin'. Well, what does that mean? Look with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3. We're going to look at just one verse there and then flip over to chapter 4. Genesis chapter 3. We're going to read it and then we'll get the context so that all this makes sense. God's talking here, and Satan is the one that's being addressed. In verse 15 of chapter 3, God says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will bruise, or literally crush, your head, and he shall bruise, or literally strike, his heel. Now flip over to chapter 4. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore a son, Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. The Lord, though, had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Cain went away very angry. His face fell. And the Lord said, Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Probably familiar with these stories, but what does this say to us? What does this teach us? Well, let's get the context back in mind. We've talked thus far about, how Satan got his start. And in an act of rebellion where he aspired to be like the Most High, rebels against God, and it seems that he, as chief among angels, expected that all of the angels, all of them were subject to his authority, would follow his lead. Well, he rebels, and some of them follow his lead, but not all of them. In fact, for everyone that follows him, too, remain faithful to the Lord. And so Satan is cast, along with his fallen angels, demonic angels at this point, a third of the angelic host cast out with him. So that first act didn't work so well. It was a swing and a miss. And Satan seemed to be operating under this premise. I have the desire, and I believe in my mind, I have the ability to be the one who is ultimately in charge. But for me to be the one who is ultimately in charge, I need all those who exist to follow me, to decide that I am the one who's in charge. Well, he didn't get all the angels. He only got a third of them. And so Satan has decided, I need to do something. And he seemed to be operating with this awareness that angels are different from us in this sense. Well, actually in a variety of ways, but in particular this way. Angels and demons do not have generational existence. By that I mean they were all made, but then they don't have children. When God made people, when God made man, he made us capable of reproduction, that generations multiplied, seemingly unending generations can come from us. And so it seems that Satan is operating under this premise. Well, I didn't get all the angels, but what I can do next is to get those that God has created in his very own image. If I can get them to follow my lead, well, then I can declare victory. And so last week we looked at his attempt to get mankind. And so he confronts Eve in the form of temptation. So we talked about that. You're familiar with that story about this forbidden fruit. Causes her to question what it is that God has said, doubt whether what God has said is correct. And so she eats of that fruit. Adam also does. And so now sin has entered into the world. And just as Satan did not know what the consequences would be of his rebellion, neither did Adam or Eve. And so as you get to verse 16 of chapter 3, God starts addressing Adam and Eve and describing consequences. He tells Eve and informs her that she and every woman who follows her is going to experience pain in childbirth. It's going to be a very different proposition. And to Adam and all men who would follow him, he explains how the earth itself is going to be difficult to work and manage because it is going to be cursed. In fact, both man and woman are going to be cursed in this sense that now the clock is ticking. They become mortal beings. They have a lifespan, and death will eventually come for them. But God is not finished in dispensing consequences, and we read in verse 15 as God expresses to Satan consequences. And he says, I'll put enmity or strife between you and the woman, between your offspring, those who follow you, and her offspring or seed. He shall bruise or literally crush your head, and you shall bruise or literally strike his heel. What does that mean? Look at that last statement. He's saying, and it's clearly metaphorical language, that you will strike the heel, you will bruise the heel of one who is to come, but that one who is to come will crush your head. What would you rather have, a bruised heel or a crushed head? I'd rather have a bruised heel because that's no big deal. But a crushed head is a mortal blow. God is speaking and using metaphorical language to Satan where the meaning is clear. Your fate is sealed and you will ultimately be destroyed. You will ultimately be defeated by one who is going to come from this woman. All right, so get this in mind because Satan had it in mind. Well, this didn't work out how I thought. I thought I would get those that follow God, and if I get them, and then the generations who come from them, well, they are going to be following my lead. It's the thought that you see Paul describe in Romans chapter 5, verse 12, where he says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so that death spread to all men, so that all have sinned. He understood and was operating under this awareness that when sin came into the world through Adam and Eve, all those who followed would then therefore be tainted by sin. If he can get Adam and Eve to rebel against God and kind of get on his side, then all those who come after them by default are going to be on my side. And so Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, and that day ends with paradise having been lost and Satan having heard, your fate is sealed and your doom is sure. And it will occur because of one who will come from the woman. So chapter 4 begins. And as chapter 4 begins, we're told that Eve conceives, she has a son. His name is Cain. Well, not much time passes, it seems, and then she has another son, Abel. And again, Satan knows what God has said. One will come from her that will crush your head. And so he's looking at Cain and Abel very closely. As chapter 4 begins to unfold, we note some differences between Cain and Abel. First of all, they differ in terms of occupation. Cain is a farmer. Abel is a shepherd. And it came time to bring offerings to the Lord, and they bring very different offerings. Cain brings fruit of the ground, some sort of vegetable or fruit or a collection of fruits and vegetables, while Abel brings a very different sacrifice, the firstborn of the flock. Now, we don't know exactly why it was. We can speculate. But the text does not tell us exactly why it was, except for this fact. We know for certain that God regarded or received as acceptable Abel's sacrifice, but did not regard and did not accept Cain's sacrifice. Well, why is that? Was it because of the difference in the actual offering, that one was vegetative and the other was a blood offering? It's possible, but it's also possible based on what we read in Hebrews 11:4, where we're told this: by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. So Abel's sacrifice is couched in the terms of faith. Abel's is not. This seems to suggest something to us about Cain and about Abel and their connection that they had with God. It seems that Abel had one that was real and legitimate, where he wanted to give God his very best, and that he operated in a relationship with God that was absolutely based on faith. By contrast, Cain does not seem to. Maybe it is that his offering was perfunctory. He's just kind of going through the motions. I got to bring something. Let me give some beets and Brussels sprouts. Nobody likes them. I don't want to eat them. So just give those to God, and that way, no harm, no foul. I've given something. I can check that off the list. But maybe it's that. But it seems, as Hebrews in Genesis are telling us something, that Abel had a very different relationship than God had. And God warns Cain because he's ticked. He's angry. You mean not accept my sacrifice? I'll give you new taters and what do you mumbling, grumbling. He's furious. Mad at God, it seems, mad at his brother. And God warns him and says, I'm telling you, do you not understand that if you do well, if you color in the lines of expectation, if you get this back out of the ditch on the road, I'm telling you, blessings can be yours, but if you color outside the lines, sin is crouching at the door and it'll defeat you. Well, the text doesn't tell us much there in Genesis. It's a very matter of fact. After that warning, there's some conversation that occurs between Cain and Abel. We don't know what was said. We don't know exactly how it unfolded. But we do know this, that Cain kills his own brother. First murder in the Bible occurs. How is it that he is acting in this murderous rage? Well, the New Testament again gives us another perspective in this, where we're told this about Cain. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 12, God cautions this. He says, do not be like Cain, who did what? Who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. Just as Satan came to Eve and got her to succumb to temptation, it seems that Satan was lurking, and at some point, in some way, in some fashion, he prompts Cain with the possibility of very much coloring outside the lines, acting out in rebellion against God and taking his brother's life. And that kind of stands to reason. Again, Satan is aware of what God has said. From this woman, from Eve, will come one who will crush your head. Well, it's Cain or it's Abel. I need to get them on my side. And as he looks at the two, Abel's the one that's offering, by faith, sacrifices to God. This is a guy who really seems to be all in. This is a guy who seems to be legitimately committed, thoroughly a follower of God. Then he looks at Cain, sees a weak link. Maybe that's my one. If I can get him, and if he's wobbling already, this can't be the one that's going to crush my head, but I can get him on my side. And somehow, through the form of temptation, prompts Cain to act, again, with murderous rage and kill his own brother. John says that he is of the devil. He's not wearing a God jersey. he is demonstrating through his actions where his commitment lies. And it is not to the Lord, it is to the enemy of God. And Satan at this point has got to be thinking, did it? I did it. I have outwit God. That first act of rebellion, that was a swing and a miss. Get kicked out of heaven. Thought I'd have all the angels with me, but only wind up with a third. Come to Adam and Eve, and I think if I get them, and I do get them to act in following my lead, and they both disobey God, and I thought I had him there. And then I'm told that she's going to have one that's going to follow her, that's going to crush my head. So that's God's plan. I've got to somehow figure out the escape route to this. She has these two sons. He gets one on his side who kills the other. It was loving it when his plan comes together. I've won. I've won. And at the very least, how this is going to end is, well, God's going to have his angels. I'm going to have my followers. And we're just going to kind of call a detente here. And he won't completely be in charge. I won't necessarily be completely in charge, but at least I'll be dealing with him fully as a peer. Abel's dead, and with him have died God's plan. Look down to verse 25 of chapter 4. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth, because she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. About the time that Satan is thinking, man, I've got God exactly now where I wanted him. I have completely foiled the plan of God. And he was talking about this nonsense about my head being crushed. Well, and that's going to come from one that's an offspring of her. Well, I've just taken care of them. She had two. I got one on my side. And the one that was on God's side, we killed him. Love it when a plan comes together. And then all of a sudden, Eve is sporting a bump. What's that? And then all of a sudden, in a period of months, there's the cries of another baby boy who gets the name Seth, that means replacement or substitute. What? Are you kidding me? It's not supposed to work this way. I took care of the problem. I took care of the threat. But now God just causes her to have another and another and another and another. There's going to be no end to this. There's going to be no end to this. How can he just do this? If I get rid of one, it seems that there's always going to be another. The one who thought he had outwit God was coming to discover that what God said, he actually meant, and his own fate was actually sealed. Most of you know Grover Minor. Where's Grover at? Is he? He was here. Yeah, there's Grover. Grover and Carolyn, welcome. This is their first Sunday back after Carolyn's heart surgery. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know it for looking. Grover's 86 years old and is in wonderful shape, except he can't hear good and can't see good. Right, Grover? Well, those are his complaints. But other than that, Grover's in great shape. Grover's a wonderful guy. Something you may not know about Grover is this. He is a champion checker player. There's tournaments across the country, regionally, and Grover is a champion checker player. I don't know exactly how it happened. I don't remember the details, but somehow Grover and our third son, Philip, got in conversation and played at some church event, played checkers. And from then, they just kind of spawned this relationship. And so Philip's 8 years old. Grover's much older, much further down in line. But they've just formed this bond. And every so many weeks or so, I'll take Philip, or Caroline will take Philip over to Grover's house, and they'll play checkers for a few hours. It's just really neat. Anyway, one day I was taking Philip over to Grover's house for him to play checkers. And I watched as Philip played Grover, and Grover squashed him like a bug, right? but Grover's a champion checker player. Philip's 8 years old. I've never played a champion checker player. I didn't even know there was a champion checker player. So I said, Grover, how about... Grover, let me play you. Now, I didn't say this, but this is my thought. It's checkers. This is not chess. There can't be... I mean, how much strategy can there be? It's kind of you move, I move, and, I'm figuring I've at least got a 50-50 chance. Philip lost, but he's 8 years old. Maybe I can be a champion checker player. I've got as good a chance of any. Anyway, so you start. You got 12 pieces on either side. I think I had red, and so red moves first. We move and the board gets shuffled up a little bit, and I lose a piece. But that's going to happen. You got to take your jumps, and that's part of the strategy. I think then Grover lost a piece. We're tied. And then I lost a second piece. And after I've lost the second piece, which means I have how many left? Grover says this to me. Well, it's over, but if you want to go ahead and play it out, we can. This is my thought. I've got this many pieces. It's not like I'm down to 2 and he's got 10. I've got 10, he's got 11, and he's just told me it's over. Well, I don't think it's over. Yeah, we'll play this out. You know what? It was over. It was over, and I just didn't know it. In fact, I'll tell you this is the honest truth. It was over before it even started. It was over the moment I decided to be his opponent. It just took it a while for it to become very clear for me. Can I tell you this about the devil? It was over the moment he decided to be the opponent of God. It was just taking him a while before it started to become very, very clear. As we try to land this plane, let me share with you just 2 verses of Scripture that are effectively self-explanatory. The writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood," that means us, "since we have flesh and blood, he," that's Jesus, "himself likewise took part of the same things." We got flesh and blood, he came and took on flesh and blood, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil. And then Jesus, in his own words, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 18, he says, "I am he who lives, yet was dead. And behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of hell and death." It was over before it started. Game, set, match. Satan thought he was dealing with a peer, when in truth he was truly cruising for a bruising. So you say, well, all right, Michael, that's kind of interesting. Some of this stuff I haven't thought about before. This is some perspective I haven't considered. But what does this have to do with me and the living of my life? And as just a person, maybe related to spiritual things, what does this have to do with me? Well, first thing I would say is this. You need to realize there is a winning and a losing side. And you need to figure out which one you're on. There is a winning and a losing side, and you've got to figure out which one you're on. Satan made a choice and lost. A third of the angels made a choice and lost. Cain made a choice and lost. And Abel, though he experienced temporary cost, has now experienced eternal gain. There's a winning and a losing side. Which side are you on? If you're puzzled or unsure about that, will you allow us to share with you how you can be on the right side? understand, secondly, this. Our enemy, and the enemy of God, though defeated, is still presently dangerous. I saw this back on the Discovery Channel sometime within the past year. I was completely unaware of this. That you can take a snake, and in this instance, it was a rattlesnake. And they killed it by cutting its head off. And they said, if and when you do that, you need to bury that head because of this fact. For up to an hour after decapitation, that snake's head can still bite you and inject you with venom. Wouldn't you hate to get bit by a snake head? But it's entirely possible. But the principle is this. That snake, whose fate is certain, it is going to die, is but for a season still very, very dangerous. The application is this. Don't, as a follower of Christ, get so cocky about Satan's doom and about how certain his future is that you forget the threat he presents, because if you do, you'll wind up being his next victim. And finally, I would say this. Gambling that what God says will not happen is always to hold a losing hand. Gambling that what God says will not happen is always to hold a losing hand. I don't know why it is this way, but somehow it seems that as people, it's only after experiencing some sort of cost, some sort of pain, that we discover, what God says He actually means. Cain had to feel loss to realize it. In fact, later in the Old Testament, we read the account of Job, and it was not until Job had lost everything that he says this to the Lord in chapter 42. Lord, I know that you can do anything, and that no plan of yours can be thwarted. That what you decide and what you declare is going to happen, it's going to happen. Satan decided, that's not the case. Found himself holding a losing hand. Cain decided. It cost him. Found himself holding a losing hand. What I'm saying is this. You don't have to experience pain and loss to decide, I'm going to take God at His word. And what He says, He actually means. And when God puts something out of bounds for me, He means that is out of bounds. And when He describes that there's consequences for that, there's consequences for acting out of bounds. But also when He says to do things and follow His lead, that results in blessing, that results in Him working for your good. When He said that, He meant it. Decide in your mind, know in your heart, that gambling that what God has said He didn't mean is always a losing proposition. Satan found himself holding a losing hand. But how about you? Where are you this morning? Is there some uncertainty of which side you're actually on? If so, this morning we can help point you in the direction and share with you from what God has said in His Word about how you can have a personal relationship with Him that can change everything for the good in your life and also for eternity. You say, well, Michael, I've already crossed that line. Well, what about me? Maybe it is that you've been operating as though God was just kind of giving some suggestions and I can do kind of things my way and it won't be a big deal. It's not going to cost me. I'm telling you, that's a losing hand. Maybe you are hearing this morning and God's showing you in your heart and life, this needs to change. Will you change it? Maybe there's a burden that you came into this place that you just want to leave here not carrying. God has invited you to cast all your cares upon Him because He cares for you. Maybe God's showing you, hey, this is where I want you to connect and plug in and invest your life. Well, this is your day as well. Following God in His lead is always a winning hand. What's in your hand? What's in your heart this morning? Will you pray with me? Lord, for giving us this passage and